From goalkeeping haulers to home debut drubbings, Match Week 2 of the WSL was packed with yet more action in England's top flight of women's football, and in today's video, we will be covering all of the action that took place this past weekend. Of course, welcome back to Infraction. Coming off the back of a narrow 2-1 defeat at the hands of Chelsea last weekend, Manchester City returned home for the first time this season to the Joy Stadium, where they welcomed Brighton and Hove Albion. And pretty much, especially from the early onset of this game, it was quite evident to see that the citizens were still acclimating themselves to the tactics of Andre Yeglitz as Brighton tore into them time and again. And the early efforts of the Seagulls would soon pay dividends thanks to an effort from Frank Kirby, which managed to ripple the net to give the Seagulls the early 1-0 lead. And as the game progressed, City did manage to come into their own. However, Brighton were still hanging in there and actually threatened to double, and in certain cases, had the ball gone to the net, tripled their lead. But unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be for the Seagulls, despite their best efforts, with Michelle Ashimang amongst many others really being in fine form in front of the box. But some very good defending and some great goalkeeping heroics were more than enough to make sure that going into the second half, the score would remain 1-0. And with the second 45 rolling on, City were starting to show signs of clicking and gelling much better to the tactics that had been laid out for them, because they really came out swinging. Brighton's Shamaka Nadozie had a lot of work to do to keep her side's very flimsy and narrow lead still intact. However, eventually the damn wall had to burst, and it burst in emphatic style with a thunderous header from Bunny Shaw to bring the citizens back into the game and to draw 1-0 everyone. And City, they were really on form after this goal, and you could see that Brighton was starting to struggle against the might of the citizens, and this is where the game really got flipped on its head as the momentum just shifted in favor of the home side. Because just 16 minutes later, the citizens would finally have their second of the game thanks to Yui Hasegawa, who scored the second goal for her side after she had just not been picked up at all by the Brighton backline, and she made sure that she would do good on the opportunity that she received to, of course, score the second goal, which did ultimately prove to be the most crucial goal of the game as City went on to pick up their first 3 points of the season. At the other end of the Friday night doubleheader, we had Arsenal taking a trip to West Ham, and this match will always live long in the memory, especially for the early proceedings of the WSL season for the rain. And if you watch this match or any of the highlights, you will know what I'm talking about. Of course, it is the howler by Arsenal's Dafty van Domselaar, who just couldn't take control or just couldn't grip the ball properly, which had come in from a cross from Shakira Martinez as it slipped out of her fingers and into the back of the net to give West Ham an early lead. But thankfully for Van Domselaar, her blushes would soon be quelled by her teammates, particularly Frida Monum, who would bring the Gunners level in the 21st minute with a very good effort. And looking at the second 45, because there really wasn't much going on in the first 45 thanks to the rain, which caused a lot of slips and slides and very crunchy tackles, particularly from West Ham. And shout out to Vivian Asei, who was just taking the most advantage out of these very slippery conditions in not only tackling and getting the ball back when her team was on the defensive, but also just being a nuisance for the likes of Steph Catley. Shout out to her. But the second 45 is where most of the action started to really take place, and Arsenal had finally managed to find their gear and their groove, especially with respect to the natural elements that were affecting their style of play, because the Gunners would soon find themselves in the lead for the first time this game, courtesy of Stina Blackstenius, who had come off the bench at halftime. And that initially narrow 1-0 lead against West Ham would soon be cushioned upon courtesy of Caitlin Ford, who, after being initially denied with her first effort being called offside, would finally get her name on the score sheet to give Arsenal the 3-1 lead. And things were pretty much wrapped up for the Gunners as they were on top of things throughout. West Ham were just chasing shadows as Arsenal had now acclimated themselves to water bending, as we could see in this game. But they weren't done yet, because of course football is 90 minutes, and it would be from the 90th minute onwards where Alessia Russo, who had a very good game mind, decided to pop up and get a few goals for herself as she bagged a brace to round out the scoring for Arsenal, who ran out very emphatic and victorious 5-1 winners over a beleaguered West Ham side, who initially started very well but faded out as the game continued. And this was very reminiscent of Arsenal's performance against London City Lionesses last week, in that Arsenal, despite going a goal down, did well to brush off the early setbacks and to come back swinging to not only gain the win but to do it with a lot of style and panache. The only issue so far in these kinds of scenarios is that Arsenal have now gone back to back in conceding first, but then also now having to fight to get the win in the end, which, whilst on paper you might think it's a good thing, ideally I'm pretty sure Renee Slegers would want for her side to just be dominating from the very first to the final whistle. And it will be very interesting to see if Arsenal come across this kind of adversity next week when they take on Manchester United. But I think even if they do come across it, they should have more than enough in the locker to make sure that they come back and make it 3 wins in 3. But time will tell, because other than that, the team is performing very well. Everybody is clicking, and it seems everybody has hit top form, which is a bit premature to say, admittedly. But when you see the performances so far in these 2 matches that they've played, there definitely is a lot of excitement to be had for Arsenal fans. Having taken a sabbatical on Saturday with the return of the Premier League, the WSL returned on Sunday with the remainder of the 4 remaining matches of the game week, starting with the triple header beginning with Chelsea versus Aston Villa. And the Villains welcomed the WSL champions to an encounter that was very, very unfortunate and unlucky for Aston Villa, who really gave it their all in this encounter, but for some reason or another, Chelsea just managed to withstand the pressure that was applied by the home side. Going into the game, and of course Aston Villa were on top of the early proceedings and actually had a fair few opportunities to make something out of the game, but unfortunately some very errant finishing and some good saves from Hannah Hampton in particular made sure that the game would remain 0-0 up until the 22nd minute, where the Villa defense just let down the Villa attack because everybody just fell asleep, and the likes of Katerina Macario and again Ellie Carpenter stood up and rose to the challenge, with Carpenter in particular getting in a cross first time into the waiting noggin of Aggie Beaver-Jones, who scored again for her side to give them the early lead. And despite going a goal down, Villa continued to plod away and to just try and get themselves back into the game, and their hard work was ultimately rewarded in one of the most sensational ways that you'll see all season, with an attack against the Honor player resulting in a one-time worldie from Ebony Salmon to bring the Villains back up on level terms with the current champions. Going into the second half, it was pretty much the same kind of affair that I've already described to you, with Villa doing their very best to not only bring it to Chelsea, but to even try and nick a win, or in this case particularly a lead, but it just wasn't happening for the Villains, and it was not for a lack of trying. And unfortunately for them, on the other end, where Villa was struggling, Chelsea were thriving, with the Blues getting their second goal of the game to take the lead after a corner set piece landed into the back of the net, courtesy of a deflected shot from Kira Walsh. With the game winding down, Villa had well and truly run out of ideas, and it wasn't due to a lack of trying, but simply because what they were trying wasn't giving them the goals in this situation that you can argue they definitely did deserve, but such is the cruelty of football. And unfortunately for them, because of their decline, Chelsea smelled blood in the water, and Sonia Pompastor made some very key changes to really drive home the point that the game is not over until the final whistle blows, with the returning Sam Kerr not only coming in to get her first few minutes of professional football in nearly just over 2 years in fact, but she also bagged herself a return goal which sparked up a lot of elation from the away stand and from her fellow teammates on the pitch, as it was a very feel-good moment for her and everyone else who supports Chelsea, as of course the Blues did run out successful 3-1 winners against the hapless Aston Villa, who despite a very improved and better performance than what they gave us last week, they just couldn't last long. And it's unfortunate because they really did their best to try and hang in there and to really give a fight to Chelsea, but it just wasn't meant to be for them on this day. Mainstream media favorites and hipsters' choice London City Lionesses succumbed to yet another clobbering, this time at the hands of Manchester United. Looking at this game, there really isn't much to write home about because Maya Leticia, Jade Riviere, Jess Park and Melvine Mallard just made it clear from the very onset that the Lionesses were far from acclimatized and ready for the rigors of the WSL, as Manchester United ran out successful 5-1 winners over the Lionesses, with of course Nikita Paris getting the consolation goal. There really isn't much to say about this game because if you really just look at the two teams and the difference in quality and experience as well, especially in the WSL, it was only ever going one way, and it's not a surprise to have seen the Lionesses be clobbered yet again by one of the rising teams of the WSL. So I think for the sake and dignity of the Lionesses, I think we can move on from this match. In more of a somewhat level-headed encounter, I use that quite generally to be fair, we had Leicester City welcoming Liverpool to the King Power Stadium, and this was quite a very turgid game. It was pretty much a tale of sit back and defend if you're Leicester City, and try and break the opposition down if you're Liverpool. And this is pretty much what happened throughout the entirety of the 90 minutes, with the Reds coming in time and again and nearly going close, particularly with the likes of Capox and Holland doing their best to try and again break down the defense and get a goal for their team, which you can argue would have been deserved given all the effort that was put across the board by Liverpool. But Leicester were just so stubborn defensively. They were not going to give the Reds an inch when it came to sniffing goal, but it doesn't matter because Jelena Leitzig, she was called upon on a few occasions regardless to keep her team in the match. The resilience of the Foxes was highly commendable, especially when they had gone down to 10 players in the second half, thanks to some very weird, albeit comical and sardonically entertaining dissent from Shannon O'Brien, who got sent off again for dissent by the referee with her second yellow of the game to leave Leicester down to just 10 players. But it seemed like going a player down was all that Leicester needed in terms of motivation, because just 3 minutes after O'Brien had been taken off, Leicester would score thanks to a very beautiful header from an unmarked Van Ekman. With the game winding down, Leicester had all but done the hard part of their work for this day, which was scoring a goal and managing to just keep Liverpool out. But towards the end, there were a few hairy moments that really needed Leipzig to be on her game, and she truly was. As come the final whistle, the Foxes registered their first 3 points of the WSL season, whereas Liverpool are now 2-0 when it comes to losing in the WSL so far, and it's gonna start causing a little bit of concern if they don't arrest this bad form quickly, because as is becoming seemingly apparent as these two games have shown, not only against Leicester but against Everton as well, Liverpool do have a problem with breaking down low blocks. So it's going to be interesting to see how teams going forward will use that to their advantage and how Liverpool will seek to address that problem, because the solution is needed much sooner rather than later. The final game took place at Goodison Park, with Everton making their bow at their new permanent home against Tottenham. Much like the previous encounter, this one was another turgid affair between the two sides, with far more freneticism and jeopardy on display. Both sides gave it a very aggressive go of things, and Spurs in particular were marginally coming out of it the better of the two early on, with some very great 1-2s between new signings Tanberg and Artinen, which led to the latter rippling the net and giving the visitors the lead. The second half maintained the tempo and flow of the previous 45, and Spurs were once again on top of things this time with an early goal to double their lead, with Tanberg going from provider to scorer as she picked one out from very far away, having caught Brosnan miles away from her line and opening her Spurs account with a glorious effort. With Spurs rounding out deserved 2-0 winners, Everton christened their new era at Goodison Park with a harrowing and frustrating defeat that was visible to see on the faces of the players and the staff, who, despite their efforts to claw themselves back into the game, the Toffees were seemingly always one step behind the Spurs, and that definitely contributed a lot to their overall performance, as watching them without any prior knowledge, you would have thought that this is the first time that all 11 players on the pitch plus the substitutes were teaming up with one another for the first time. Unfortunately for them, this excuse wouldn't fly, because we did see their performance against Liverpool last week, and we know that they're far more capable of more than what they produced in this game. So here, hopefully, this is nothing more than just a freak result and performance. And with game week 2 of the WSL wrapped up, Arsenal and Manchester United continue as they mean to go on in first and second place respectively on goal difference, whereas Chelsea appear to be taking more of a measured approach to their WSL campaign so far, which will be very interesting to see how it pans out next week for the Blues, as they can take advantage given that the former two are going up against each other next weekend. So interesting times are ahead, especially at the top of the table. And just before I go, a special mention must go to the streaming quality of the WSL this week, as it was markedly improved from last week, and hopefully they do continue to improve as the weeks go by. And it was also very nice to see many return to the pitch this weekend, and hopefully the specter of injury stays very far away from as many players as possible across the globe this season. That is going to be all for today, and thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed, then make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.